We are here today for another Q&A session interview at the Experts for Security and Global Affairs Association. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Alexander Nice, an expert covering post-Soviet space and Russian affairs. Welcome, Mr. Nice, and we are very happy to have you as a guest in Bucharest, Romania. And my first question for you will be, how did you find the audience interested or not in Russian affairs?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak at your event this morning. I found the event very stimulating. It was very interesting to engage with experts from different countries and from Romania. Of course, Romania's relations with Ukraine and with Russia are very specific, and there are specific security and political concerns. And so it's always very interesting to see how Russia is seen through that framework, as well as comparing with how Russia is seen from the UK, which, of course, is carries a specific set of issues at the moment.
I think for the most part of the audience, the biggest question for you, it will be what are the challenges for United Kingdom now after re-election of the new old president of Russian Federation, I mean of Mr. Vladimir Putin, after the Skripal case, and it was in the same time as the election campaign period. How London will manage this complicated situation now?
Well, I think the Skripal case is obviously going to hang over UK-Russia relations for the foreseeable future. And the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter illustrates in some ways both the successes and also the weaknesses of the UK policy towards Russia over the last few years. Weaknesses because, of course, this is not the first time that we have seen an attack on a UK resident which, according to the UK government, was directed by the Russian state. We had the Litvinenko murder in just over 10 years ago. And at the time, it's clear that the measures that were taken were insufficient to deter a repeat attack on UK soil. So in that sense, we can say that UK policy in terms of protecting its residents and its citizens and Russian dissidents living in the country has failed. On the other hand, I suspect that Russia was surprised by the strength of the response, not simply from the UK side, but that the UK was able to put together a very strong coalition within the EU, from the US and the broader Western community, which led to a collective expulsion of diplomats, which clearly showed that countries of the West supported the UK position and found the actions of the Russian state to be unacceptable. Whether that is sufficient deterrence and punishment to discourage similar actions in the future is an open question, and there is now a debate taking place in Britain about further measures that could be taken, and of course the main area of focus is on Britain's financial centre, the City of London, which is a major hub for Russian investment and Russian capital abroad.
Do you think this can be appreciated as a fresh start for British diplomacy? I mean, not only in relation with Moscow, but I mean in relation with Washington, maybe with Brussels.
Well, I think
can be possible.
In some ways, with Britain leaving the EU, then actually Britain is looking for ways to maintain close cooperation with the EU partners. One of those areas is security. So I think Britain is going to talk up and emphasize the contribution it makes to European security, and a big focus of that will be on managing the risks and the threats posed by Russia. So in that sense, I think we can expect to continue to see a strong line taken by Britain, and Britain to continue to support the EU and sectoral sanctions that are on Russia.
2 years ago, during an interview, you were asked about what is the main challenge for the EU-Russia relationship. Do you think that your answer will be the same?
I think the fundamental area of disagreement between EU and Russia is and will remain for the foreseeable future what we might call the common neighborhood. The countries in between, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, which are not part of the EU, but in the case of Ukraine and Moldova have sought association agreements with the EU. And indeed Georgia and the South Caucasus. Fundamentally, Russia sees the expansion of EU influence and NATO integration as an existential threat, or the Russian leadership sees it, and that is not going to go away. And there is therefore going to be this competition, I think inevitably will continue between the EU and Russia for the foreseeable future, and fundamentally any political change in any of these countries, which is inevitably going to happen, could potentially be politicized, geopoliticized, and lead to another spate of tensions between Russia and the West and Russia and the EU. And that is the biggest concern, which I think has to worry all EU policymakers.
The Russian strategy for the European Union is divide et impera. Do you think that Russia will have the same strategy for the next 4 years regarding EU? Because you have mentioned before the unification of interests between United Kingdom and European Union and United States. Mm-hmm. Do you think it is possible to have this strategy as a base for the approach of Europe?
I think in some ways their approach is shaped by the fact that they don't have many options. Mm-hmm. As we talked about this morning, then the domestic policy is to present Russia as a besieged fortress. Certainly the Russian leadership see themselves as effectively at war with the West, certainly in an open confrontation. And there appears to be very little interest in the moment in seeking some sort of rapprochement with EU or the US, which would lead to a relaxation of sanctions. And in the current environment, the Russian leadership does not have a lot of possible partners which they can work with. And that's one of the reasons why they seek to support either openly or indirectly fringe parties on the right and left, because the centrist parties, the political mainstream at the moment in most countries does not have an interest in significant dealings with Russia. One of the big hopes you see expressed by Russian analysts, for example, in the writings of analysts associated with the Valdai Club of experts, is that the America First policy of Donald Trump, although it's not realized the hopes of the Russian leadership in terms of sanctions relief, in fact the opposite, might drive a wedge between the US and the EU, and potentially that may happen. Whether that would lead to a change of policy from the EU vis-à-vis Russia, I'm more skeptical. But you know, that dynamic is there, and I think is one that Russia is keen to exploit.
Do you think the sanctions are efficient, like they are looking right now? I mean, after years and years of sanctions, 4 years of sanctions already, do you think they are still an efficient tool against Russia or not?
I mean,
because we are looking at what is happening with the assets of those people who are included in the Putin lists, and we are seeing a lot of movements. I mean, Deripaska case, who changed the owners of his own actives now on his relatives from France, I think. And how efficient will be the sanctions in the future?
In terms of the impact of sanctions, the estimates seem to be that sanctions have costs of 1 to 1.5% of GDP a year. The impact of sanctions in terms of economic costs is likely to decline in the short to medium term because of these workarounds, because companies can deleverage, find other sources of financing. But nevertheless, there is I think the main concern, if I were a Russian policymaker thinking about the long term, and that's not necessarily what many in the regime are doing, but is the long-term impact, particularly of restrictions on technological transfer for the oil and gas sector, for in particular, which could, in the long term, undermine levels of production. But we're a long way from that. I think the economic costs of sanctions are bearable for Russia. Having said that, trying to prove the political impact of sanctions, are they a sufficient deterrent, is very difficult because we don't have the counter example. Had sectoral sanctions not been implemented, would Russia's policy in Ukraine have been different? Would they be pushing harder? Possibly. The reality is there are a limited number of tools available, and I think sanctions are one of them, and they do send a message and in the absence of a willingness or ability to confront Russia militarily, then perhaps they are the only option available.
And it seems to me that the list of those under sanctions is completed with a person very loyal to Vladimir Putin. That's why they are in the list from the beginning. Do you think they will use soon enough exit strategy from that list or not?
Well, the risks of you mean sort of moving away, or
yes, moving away.
The sanctions could lead to some sort of split in the elite.
Because this was, I think, the main goal of the list of sanctions imposed to Russians.
So far, we've not seen any indication of that, and partly, of course, the Russian state has sought to compensate businessmen who have been put under sanction. And very openly, they've said that we will receive state support and bailouts if necessary. So that's one aspect, and also the risks of trying to, as it were, move out of the system or go in opposition to the system are very great. So I think that the likelihood that it will lead to sort of split in the elite in the foreseeable future is fairly low. Obviously, there is a group of policymakers and individuals within the leadership who would like to see sanctions raised or lifted, and also that see the damage which Russian foreign policy is doing to the interests and the economy of Russia. But voicing those opinions is very difficult in the current climate. And broadly speaking, the Russian state is structured around, as I said before, a besieged fortress, and one which is trying to insulate itself from the West and the impact of sanctions, rather than a changing policy in order to get them lifted.
How important is now to have leaders with a vision regarding world order, regarding economics, regarding politics, regarding democracy?
The potential for the emergence of those kind of leaders, I think, is limited. I mean, it's needed because clearly there are systemic problems or even a systemic crisis in the way the Eurozone is constructed, and perhaps the EU. Clear indications that there needs to be some sort of EU reform. But who is going to lead that? The strategy of the major leading government, or in particular the German government, is fighting fires as they come up, and coming up with a vision for how the EU could be shaped in the future, whilst also managing the Italy crisis, for example, and indeed Brexit, is very difficult. I think slowly a discussion is taking place on the future contours of the EU and of the Eurozone, and I am confident actually that something will come out of that. And it's a necessary, difficult but very necessary discussion to have. But developing a consensus on a vision is very difficult, because the global order as a whole is as we know, in a state of serious flux.
You have followed Babchenko case, it's very important for Ukraine. You have followed Skripal case, very important for United Kingdom. Can you see a difference in the strategy of Russian Federation regarding these two cases or not? Or the reaction is the same, to neglect the involvement of the Russian Federation in Ukraine or in the United Kingdom?
It's very difficult to comment on and compare the two cases because we still lack a lot of information about the Babchenko case and what exactly happened and why the decision was taken to stage his assassination. The Ukrainian secret services insist that this was the only way that they could find out the killers, but also the intentions of those behind the killing to pursue other figures in Ukraine. It seems to me that it's very important that the secret services and Ukrainian authorities produce evidence soon about why it was necessary to conduct this operation like this, because there is a risk otherwise that the next time that an incident like this occurs in Ukraine or indeed anywhere else in Europe, that Russia has its talking points already. That again, this is staged. You always accuse us of being behind it, and yet, last time you said there was an assassination. It turned out it was all stage managed. In the era of post-truth, fake news, as we've been talking about, then it also requires actually careful and honest approach from those outside Russia and a careful handling of the facts. And certainly I think one of the lessons also of the Skripal case is that the UK needed to maintain a very clear messaging about what is known, what the evidence was for the claims they were going to make. And there was a point at which it seemed that the Foreign Minister, Boris Johnson, had made claims about the evidence available at the crime scene, which had shown that it was Russian involvement, which wasn't quite the case. And in fact, it seems that the main evidence of Russian involvement, apart from Occam's razor and the assumption, well, who else could be behind that, was based on intelligence and intelligence reports, rather than actually toxicology research, which could establish that it was Novichok that was behind the poison, but couldn't actually show where this poison was sourced from. So control over messaging and a clear and honest transmission of your message to the media is extremely important, and some of that has been blurred in the Babchenko case.
Do you think that those changes in the president list, in the government, I mean in Medvedev's government, are important for Russian Federation and for foreign public debate or not? Because we are seeing a lot of changes. Rogozin is out, Surkov maybe out soon enough, and those are persons very important for the neighborhood, as I mentioned, for Moldova, for Ukraine, and we have a lot of changes in the top priority list of persons in the government. I mean, prime minister post was introduced for a new person in the system. We have witnessed a lot of changes in the presidential administration recently. How do you think they will affect the neighborhood? How will affect the relationship with other states? Among them can be United Kingdom as well.
My broad expectation is that the reshuffles don't indicate a significant change in policy. The elevation of Siluanov to First Deputy Prime Minister, I think, is a reflection of the fact that he is regarded as having dealt with the crisis very well and actually having maintained fiscal stability very successfully. And it suggests that the Finance Ministry is going to retain a strong control over the budget, and that the conservative fiscal policy that Russia has been pursuing will be continued. In terms of the other changes, if you look at the agenda for the next term, which was set out firstly in Putin's speech, the the Federal Assembly in March, and then his May decrees, it seems to have embodied most of the proposals that came out from his old ally and former finance minister Alexei Kudrin in terms of the goals, rapid economic growth of around 4% a year, even higher growth in productivity, establishing Russia as the 5th largest economy in the world in purchasing parity terms. Very ambitious goals, but without any of the institutional reform of which Putin has had almost nothing to say, which Kudrin has been putting forward. And alongside these ambitious socioeconomic targets, the last third of his speech to the Federal Assembly was all about the new weaponry which Russia was being developed, and seemed to emphasize the fact that confrontation with the West would continue in the next term, and he was not interested in pursuing some kind of rapprochement in order to create the conditions for external support for the modernization agenda. So in that sense, I don't really see the reshuffle or the changes in personnel as fundamentally shifting Russia's approach to foreign policy in general, or indeed the near abroad. But of course, some small changes of emphasis may follow if indeed the role of Surkov is declining, or some other figures.
What should be the content of our strategy? Because we are still thinking in those terms that Brexit is not happening yet. We still have 2 years or 1 year until the Brexit.
9 months.
Yes. How do you see our approach to Russia in those terms?
For Romania's approach?
I mean for the European Union, and I mean to United Kingdom as still a part of the European Union.
Well, of course, I mean, one should always look for the opportunity for dialogue if it's there, if it can be meaningful, and indeed the possibility of a change in relations. And things can change very quickly in international politics, and who knows what changes will come to Russia in the next 10 years. But I think the working assumption of EU and UK policymakers should be that confrontation will endure, and also not to seek seek engagement or dialogue for the sake of it. If there is no interest or areas of common interest to be discussed, and there's no interest from the Russian side. When it comes to Russia, there seems always to be this knee-jerk response that, well, we simply have to keep on engaging, and we have to try and improve relations because of other interests. And of course, Russia is a major player, and there are very important issues to be discussed with Russia. Most critically, actually, arms control, which is one that has to be led by the US. There is a not insignificant risk that the arms control framework that exists may start to fall apart. But I think we shouldn't necessarily consider it a failure of EU policy if confrontation endures. If actually the cost of removing that confrontation means giving up on other key EU priorities, high up on which is the integrity of the European Union, but also the security of the broader neighborhood, including Ukraine and the sovereignty of Ukraine. Having said that, as I noted in my speech earlier in our event this morning, I think it is absolutely essential that we listen to and take seriously the threats and concerns expressed by Russia, which is not the same as accepting their legitimacy. But in the past, particularly on Ukraine, I don't think that the Western community and the EU has taken seriously the threats put forward by Russia regarding the implications, for example, of an association agreement or Ukraine's integration with the EU. And we can't lose sight of the fact that Russia has twice gone to war in the last 10 years in order, quite specifically, to prevent countries from joining
NATO?
We are talking a lot about the high-level intervention, I mean diplomatic intervention, high-level inclusion of Russian officials. But what about civil society? Do you need, or we need more interaction between us and Russian experts or not at this point?
I think as much interaction as can take place on academic level, on civil society, on people-to-people level is to be welcomed. One of the great regrets I have from the latest conflict between the UK and Russia is the closure of the British Council in Russia, which did very important work in thickening cultural ties between Russia and the UK. All of this to be welcomed and to be encouraged, and I think it's vital to signal that the conflict which the EU has with Russia is with the Russian leadership and not with ordinary Russians. Having said that, of course, the space for support for civil society has been seriously restricted, and I think EU grant givers and external actors need to understand the pressures which Russian civil society now works under, the legal restrictions now that are on many of them to receive funds from abroad, and the problems that interaction with them may cause. That's not to say they shouldn't happen, but sensitivities are required. But of course, I mean, as far as possible, I think interaction and bringing as many Russian experts to Europe and traveling as much as possible in Russia is essential. The more dialogue we have at all levels, the better.
Can be Romania a link between British experts and Russian experts in those difficult situations, like?
By all means, I think any as I say, any forum is a useful one for the sounding of an exchange of opinions.
Mr. Alexander Nice, I would like to thank you. We will be very happy if you will join our future events here in Romania, in Bucharest, and maybe in Moldova, and in the neighborhood that we approached today to the debate.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to working with you again in the future.